Hello watch enthusiasts, and welcome to my third instalment of my Baselworld 2019 coverage. And this year we've seen a variety of pieces in the dress watch sort of realms, with everything from very traditional but very beautifully conceived Patek Philippe's, all the way through to some very forward-looking models from Zenith, which I think really will define the future in terms of luxury dress watches. Aside from this, we've also seen a truly remarkable super watch at the very zenith of high horology from Greubel Forsey, as well as a quite remarkable citizen which really pushes the edge of the envelope where quartz movements are concerned. And so in this video I'd like to cover this range of pieces from that dress watch category. But before I begin, I would of course like to encourage you all to like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed this video or you find it useful and interesting, in order to be able to help the channel, also to be able to catch the rest of my content for Baselworld this year. Also, do follow me on Instagram at the address which is now on the screen to be able to access more content which otherwise wouldn't be available here on the channel. And before I begin the video, I would also like to draw your attention to two personal sales from my collection which are taking place at the present time, in order to be able to fund further purchases. And so I'm selling my Zin 104 ST SAIW, which is a 2-year-old example of a Zin 104 at this point, as waiting times for these pieces just extend, which offers you a very well serviced piece in very good condition, which comes with all box papers and of course the original strap. And the price I'm asking for this piece is £950. Aside from that, I'm also selling my Seiko Marine Master SBDX 017, which is the last of the Marine Master 300s with Marine Master on the dial. Also, this piece is, as is seen in the official listings and pricings, about £1,000 less than the new version, creating quite a difference, and the watch is in very good condition with an unused bracelet and strap, and of course all box and papers for £2,000. And so if you're interested in either of these pieces, then do drop me an email at the address which is now on the screen. Now the first watch I'd like to speak about is rather a remarkable citizen, because this is the Citizen 0100, which is in fact the name of the calibre used inside this watch, and it's designed squarely to be a limited edition dress watch to commemorate the 100th anniversary of this brand, which celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2018. Now this movement has been seen before in a pocket watch which was a limited run piece, but now they're releasing it for the first time in a wristwatch form, as a sort of a super eco-drive movement, if you will, a movement which really will define its segment as far as quartz watches and quartz movements go. Now to talk you through the general premise of this watch, it's a dress watch which is 37.5mm wide, giving it a very delicate size and a very well chosen size, I feel, for a traditional dress watch. It's also available in two different materials with 3 different dials, and so there will be 100 pieces made with an ivory dial, or rather ivory coloured dial I should specify, which is 18 karat white gold, as well as 2 super titanium versions, which is to say a very scratch resistant form of titanium, with 200 being made with a mother of pearl dial and 500 with a metallic anthracite dial with a particular pattern to it. And I feel the design of these watches represents the technological know-how that Citizen have, yet with the rather understated form this watch takes, because one sees that on the version in titanium one has a matching bracelet which is very delicate, as well as a leather strap available for the white gold version. The dials are similarly simple, with simply the hours, the minutes and the seconds, but really it's what's going on inside this watch which makes its 5 ATM water-resistant case all the more interesting considering the movement. If you look behind the anti-reflective sapphire crystal of this watch, or the anti-reflective sapphire caseback, you find a calibre which is truly remarkable. And this is the 0100 calibre, a calibre seen before in Citizen Pocket Watch, but never before in this wristwatch form. And it takes the eco-drive form, so one has a photovoltaic cell as the dial, which allows it to be charged, thus giving a 6-month power reserve. But if one looks at the rest of the movement, it is very much designed to be a competitor for the quartz movements and quartz watches of Grand Seiko. Because one finds that this watch is a truly remarkable piece where the movement is concerned, because it shares more, in truth, with a high-end mechanical movement than with your Bogo standard quartz movement with 17 jewels and full decoration. Of course, the accuracy of this watch is truly legendary, with a plus or minus 1 second per year rating, which is beyond anything that Seiko can produce at the present time, and does redefine this category quite completely. And aside from using very specialised springs and gears to ensure that there's absolute alignment between the hands and the indices on the dial, one also has accuracy assured by the fact that this watch runs at a much higher frequency than a normal quartz movement. So where a normal quartz movement would run at about 32 kHz, this watch runs at well in excess of 8 MHz, which is an incredible increase in terms of frequency, and is courtesy of AT cut crystals rather than the normal tuning fork shaped crystals, in order to be able to run this quartz movement. And of course the fact that this watch monitors itself once every minute for temperature and also for frequency means that this watch really is able to keep time to a spectacular level. Of course the price for this watch is not small considering the fact that it is such a high class movement, and also the fact that it is truly something new for the industry. And so the price for either of the titanium versions is $7,400 whilst the gold version is $16,800. Now sticking with the theme of technical innovation, one has to look at the Zenith Defy Inventor, a piece which I never believed would be released this year, but I'm absolutely thrilled to have seen as a new piece from Zenith, who I must say as a brand are producing some incredible pieces these days. And this piece continues as an extension of the Defy Lab, which was released in 2017 as a whole new interpretation of the concept of an escapement. And so in short, and I have put a link to the video in which I explain this technology properly and at length, but the concept of this is that one has a normal movement in many senses, but placed on the top of it, one has a flat piece of silicon which has springs built into the shape of it, so that it's able to oscillate by about 6 degrees rather than the 300 one might occasionally see from a balance wheel. However, due to this much reduced amplitude of movement, this is able to oscillate at a much higher beat rate. And so on the original version of the Defy Lab, which was released in 2017, it ran at 15 Hz or 108,000 vibrations per hour, which is enormous by comparison to the 4 Hz one sees from a normal mechanical movement. However, this version actually increases that to 18 Hz or 129,600 vibrations per hour in the pursuit of accuracy. And so this means that one has an incredibly high beat rate, and so the second hand flows wonderfully around the dial, which is quite remarkable, and because of the low amplitude of this, one's able to still keep a reasonable power reserve of 50 hours. And so the movement placed in this watch is the caliber ZO9100, and this piece has 18 joules, and is a general refinement of that automatic movement used in the Defy Lab. And the similarities don't stop there, with the exception of one change to the escape wheel on this watch, which is now a very different design in a different place on the dial and the movement, and which is now equipped with flexible teeth to be able to account for this different movement, which does show development here. One also sees a change in the case material, although the case dimensions remain the same at 44mm by 14.5mm. Because whereas the last one was produced entirely out of aeroneth, which is essentially foamed aluminium, which then has a polymer which fills in all of the air gaps within that sort of lattice that's formed, this watch now only has a bezel made out of this, whilst the rest of the case is made out of titanium, which I think makes it a much more approachable piece for the vast majority of buyers, but also will make it a more conventional piece in terms of appearance and finishes, which I think will go appreciated. And the price for this piece will be $17,800 whilst the limited edition of these pieces hasn't been announced in terms of numbers. It's assumed that it'll be about 200 pieces. Grand Seiko has released 4 new pieces in their Elegance line, which was conceived to be a more delicate and more refined form of their watches, with manually wound spring drive movements and much less cluttered dials and product catalogues in terms of different details and functions. And I feel what's important about these 4 releases is they cement the Elegance line in the Grand Seiko product catalogue as a whole, which I think was very, very important, as there was expectation for more pieces to be released when the original Elegance line was released a few months ago. And these watches have to be broken largely into 2 different sections: the limited edition versions in platinum, and then the gold and steel models, which are standard production and have a few mechanical differences too. Now the shared features are that these watches are all 30 metres water resistant, and feature a 38.5mm case, which is very delicate and very much along the lines of Grand Seiko of old, with these very delicate polished bevels, and also a rather beautiful domed crystal on the front, which I think frames the sharpness of the hands beautifully. Of course, these watches do have a general base for their movement which is shared to some degree, and it's the 7R14 seen in the Credor HE2 which has gained such popularity and is a personal favourite of mine as far as delicate and exquisitely well-made watchmaking goes. And of course the fact that they have this particular movement base means that you get the additional functionality of a power reserve indicator visible through the exhibition caseback on the back of the movement, which is very useful for a manually wound watch. Of course, the ones which are going to receive most applause are the models which are the limited edition platinum versions for this 20th anniversary. And rather unfortunately, and in fact like a great deal of the other dress watches, as a real trend unfortunately of this year's Baselworld, these watches don't come cheap. Now, naturally these watches in platinum were always going to be expensive, and with limited editions being the order of the day for Grand Seiko, one can sort of understand the pricing. But these watches come in at $76,000 and $57,000 respectively. And so one sees two different references. The first in the limited edition of 30 being the SBGZ001. And this piece features a hammered and hand-decorated case, which matches the snowflake dial one also gets with this watch. And it should be noted that these platinum versions don't feature paint or any sort of print on the dial, whereas instead all of the markings, aside from the markers themselves, which are of course placed on the surface of the dial, all of the writing and text is engraved into the dial itself. And I think this is wonderfully mirrored by the case around the rest of this dial. The second limited edition is of 500, and this is the SBGZ003. And this is a much more simple dial, which is much more muted, much more matted, and it has the exquisitely polished surfaces around the case, which are of course done in the usual Zaratsu technique to give this incredible lustre to the case, but perhaps has a little bit less character than the hand-finished case with this particular form, which comes in the form of that limited edition of 30. However, either way, you are getting a truly spectacular watch, which is produced by the increasingly famous micro artist studio, which is responsible for the HE2 from Credor. And this means the movement inside this watch is quite remarkable too, because this is the 9R02, which has an 84-hour power reserve and is truly exquisitely finished. This has been cited as the most beautiful movement Seiko have ever made, which I think says a great deal about this piece, with beautiful polishing around the edges of the various plates, as well as spectacular finishing on the surfaces themselves. Of course, one also has increased decoration around aspects such as, for example, the power reserve indicator, and each of the areas such as the spring barrel are decorated and skeletonized, and so it really is a masterful thing to look at. Interestingly, this watch also has some of the Credor technology of that torque recovery system, which means that the power reserve is extended by recovering some of the torque, which would otherwise have been lost from the movement. And of course, being spring drive movements, these are incredibly accurate by using that electrical brake in order to slow a glide wheel rather than having a normal balance wheel, and also using a quartz regulator to be able to regulate this watch, which I think is a very clever way of combining mechanical with quartz in a fantastic package which offers you true craftsmanship but with a forward-looking technology. And so these watches are accurate to plus or minus 1 second per day. Of course, one also sees two non-limited editions in the form of the SBGY002 and SBGY003. And these pieces are slightly thicker in terms of their case, at 10.2mm thick, and are either in 18-karat yellow gold with a snowflake style of dial, or stainless steel with a sunray style of dial. And both, I think, look fantastic and do represent very interesting directions for Grand Seiko. And they have more traditional dial styles with applied markers, and also an applied logo with a printed Grand Seiko logo, as well as spring drive. And these come in at a more affordable sort of price range, albeit sort of Rolex levels, if you will, or equivalent to the equivalent Rolex dress watch in precious metals or steel. And so the steel version is $7,600, whilst the gold version is $25,000. And mechanically, these are also somewhat different because they use, instead of the 9R02, they use the 9R31, which is a less decorated version and has a slightly different plate design, so it doesn't have the torque recovery system, which means that you only get 72 hours of power reserve rather than 84. But you do still get a thoroughly well-decorated movement, and whilst its decoration may appear somewhat more sparingly applied than in the case of that higher-end piece, it will certainly provide you with incredibly high accuracy and a thoroughly beautiful movement in terms of technology and in terms of innovation. Now, a watch which has turned quite a lot of heads, and I think brought quite a few smiles to the Patek Philippe booth, has been the new reference 5212A, or in other words the Calatrava weekly calendar, which is a stainless steel watch which is 40mm by 10.79mm, and thus squarely aimed at that automatic range of dress watches from Patek Philippe. However, this piece is wonderful in the sense that, unlike a lot of Pateks, it has a real sense of humour, which I appreciate enormously. Because I do like the way Patek do things with regards to their watches. I think they have some absolutely classic designs, and whilst they're not the most innovative brand in the world, they do things in an extremely high quality way, and with undeniable attention to detail. And this piece features a case which is not dissimilar from the 5320G perpetual calendar released in 2017, which I also happen to love. One sees these stepped lugs, these stepped sides to the case, a crown which is sunken into the side of the case for a very elegant appearance, and of course the dial does retain some true Calatrava design pieces, such as for instance those indices, which are in this case in black and gold, which one also sees in the hands, and one sees the hands as these Dauphine style, which really do help to keep that image of a traditional dress watch in spite of the additional complications and details to this timepiece. And of course, acting as the main attraction to this watch, one has a weekly calendar. And this is a feature not often seen on a watch, just because there's very limited application for this if you're not, for example, an accountant who needs to be able to monitor the weeks of the year. And one quirk of this watch is that it will actually count to 53 weeks due to the fact that the first week of the year won't necessarily start at the beginning of the week, and so one ends up with a discrepancy which can end up, according to the ISO standardization of these sorts of systems, does result occasionally in the 53rd week, so that's needed on the dial. But really it's the way the dial demonstrates this that has raised more eyebrows, because this watch shows a handwritten style of text which is thoroughly uncharacteristic of Patek Philippe's usual ways. However, I do appreciate the way they've done this, because it gives a very youthful charm to this watch, which I think it desperately needed, and which really makes this watch into something truly desirable and very interesting. Because one sees around the edge of the dial the use of those markers, as well as the months which are demonstrated around the edge of those weeks, which I think is an interesting touch, and allows this watch to take on the form of an annual calendar as well, which is interesting too. But the cream of the dial appears very subtle and very subdued, but the fact they've used this handwritten text everywhere, including the date wheel, shows the care taken with this timepiece, whilst a calf leather strap does give a more youthful and more casual look to this timepiece. And beating inside this watch is the 50 jewel 26-330 SCJ SE caliber, which has a 45-hour power reserve, beautiful decoration, and of course is automatic winding, running at 4 Hz with a Gyromax balance and a Spiromax silicon balance spring. And this allows the watch to take on both a traditional but also very forward-looking form, and I must say for its price of £25,610, this piece is by no means cheap, but I have no doubt will sell extremely well considering the popularity of steel, but also the fact that this watch is very different to anything else in the catalogue. Now the second watch and penultimate Patek Philippe in this video is the Patek Philippe reference 5235/50R, and this is a piece which was initially released as a concept of a new piece from Patek in 2011, and this piece revealed something very different for Patek Philippe because it used an entirely new movement which featured a micro rotor as well as a Cylinvar anti-magnetic oscillator and Gyromax balance with the Spiromax silicon balance spring, which now are really very key components to the general Patek Philippe concept in most of their watches. And this allowed the watch to take on a magnetism-free and lubrication-free setup in several parts of the movement. And this, I think, aligned very well with the concept of the regulator which they're using here, which allowed the watch to take on this separate display for the minutes, the hours and the seconds, as well of course as having the annual calendar displayed. And this was a very interesting concept because of course the regulator was designed not really for wristwatches but rather for pocket watches used in order to regulate other watches, and so as a result separating each of the registers on the dial allows it to be easier to use and allowed you to focus on the minutes as that key graduation on the dial. But with this watch it really took that to heart with this anti-magnetic technology and also with that resistance to shocks and also the removal of lubrication from certain parts of the movement. But now it's available in 18-karat rose gold with a 40.5mm case by 10mm thick, which is quite remarkable for an annual calendar in this form with the regulator setup as well. And so of course it has a sapphire crystal and exhibition set case back to be able to see the movement, and the case is a rather beautiful, if somewhat simple design, with these narrow lugs which are brushed on their sides and polished on their tops as well. And when one looks at the dial one sees this rather beautiful warm brown anthracite dial with a vertical brushing as well as golden rims around each of those subdials, and this beautiful style of font with curled sixes running around that outside of the dial, which I think is wonderful for the minutes. Also, the presentation of the annual calendar here is a really wonderful thing to behold, with the date placed at 6 o'clock, the day of the week placed on the left, and the month on the right. But if any part of this watch deserves further attention, it's the movement which was developed specifically for that 2011 release of this line, which is rather rare when Patek Philippe tend to recycle movements and continue using them in a very conservative way for many years. And this is the caliber 31-260 REGQA, an automatic micro-rotor movement which has a few quirks which make it truly interesting, apart from that regulator annual calendar setup. because one sees a 48-hour power reserve, which, as has been pointed out by some people, does seem rather short. But the interesting thing about this is that Patek Philippe do use a much longer mainspring than they would need for this power reserve in order to be able to only use it at its most accurate point. So what one notices with a lot of watches is that they become less accurate when they have either a very high wind on their spring or a very low wind, so generally keeping them somewhere in the middle will give you the greatest accuracy. And so as a result, they've done that with this watch by enforcing that use by shortening the power reserve despite using a much longer mainspring, which is quite curious. Also, the beat rate is a very irregular choice of 3.2 Hz, or 23,040 vibrations per hour, with of course that annual calendar as well, which makes this a very interesting piece, and of course if one looks at it, it is a beautiful movement to observe as well. And so the price for this piece will be £39,680. Now the final piece I'd like to speak about is the Greubel Forsey GMT Quadruple Tourbillon. And this piece really had to be spoken about in this video, because whilst those Patek Philippe's are beautiful and certainly quite remarkable pieces of watchmaking, this presents a very different level of watchmaking at a much higher sort of range. Because this piece presents a 46.5mm case, which is 17.45mm thick, meaning this is truly an imposing white gold timepiece. However, in terms of its functionality and also in terms of the quality of the watchmaking within this piece, it stands alone. Because one has a setup whereby this watch has 4 tourbillons operating, albeit only on 2 different mounts. So one has 2 double tourbillons, which is something which Greubel Forsey is quite well acquainted with and well versed in, having these double tourbillons, so 2-axis tourbillons. And so one has these tourbillons which have an outer cage which rotates once every 4 minutes, whilst an inner cage which has a free-sprung weighted balance which rotates once a minute. And so as a result one does end up with a quadruple tourbillon setup, which is conceived as a means of preventing these watches from ever being in a position where their accuracy will be any less than optimal, which I think is admirable and quite remarkable, though admittedly at this sort of price range it becomes more academic than anything else. But even looking past the mastery of mechanisation needed to be able to put these double tourbillons into action, I find it quite remarkable to see the other features of this movement which also demonstrate just a fantastic understanding of watchmaking, with a 72-hour power reserve running at 3 Hz and of course 84 joules. But it's the way that those tourbillons operate, because the concept of double escapements, or rather having double balances, is one which is very well documented and very well used, but seen in this form it truly is remarkable with the use of a spherical differential which is proprietary to the brand in order to be able to split the impulse between these two, and thus be able to create an average of the two balances, and as a result be able to make the watch ultimately much more accurate, which is a remarkable thing to see, and something which on this level is a remarkable piece of watchmaking. But also this watch is designed to be a traveller's watch, and certainly achieves that with the use of several time zones displayed. And so looking at the front of the watch, one sees the large main display for the time, with that darkened dial, with that rather attractive patterning. And then one also sees a second time zone which is seen next to it, with of course the power reserve indicator there as well. And then one sees a world time function placed around that globe, which creates a very three-dimensional effect, and quite a wonderful display, especially if you turn the watch over, and then see the fact that it has the various locations and their times displayed on a rotating piece, which is all wonderful to witness, and makes this watch a true piece of mechanised art, as opposed to simply a wristwatch. Now, unsurprisingly, this watch doesn't come cheap at all. It's an $820,000 watch, produced in 11 pieces, but I think as a showcase of what Greubel Forsey are able to create, it really is a spectacular model. And so I'll conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices for this video, and certainly in terms of what you thought of the releases in general at Baselworld where dress watches were concerned. Because I think of all of the categories, dress watches were very much something which only really occupied the higher tiers of watchmaking. Of course, Seiko did release a couple of more affordable pieces in these realms, but I don't feel they were different enough to warrant speaking about in this video. So I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say and what you thought of these choices, because it always interests me as a creator of content. And if you did enjoy this video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, out.